Hi, everybody. I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you have been keeping up with all the assigned readings, slides, and recorded lectures. So, I'm sure you have seen LMS. On LMS, I've uploaded detailed assignment guidelines. Your assignment is due on 17th April. So, make sure that you understand all your instructions related to the assignment. If you're not clear about any instructions, please write me an email or just message me on LMS. I'll be happy to clarify any ambiguities related to the assignment. So, moving on to this week's lecture. This week, which is week 11, we are going to be discussing intergovernmental administration. More specifically, we are going to be talking about the theory of federalism, and I'm going to be bringing in some examples from abroad as well in terms of how federalism is practiced in different parts of the world. In the second part of this lecture, we are going to be discussing how federalism is actually practiced with respect to Pakistan. So, this week's lecture is going to be a bit detailed, so I've decided to break it down into two parts. So, this is currently the first part of week 11 lecture. Make sure once you're done with this particular video, move on to the second part of the video as well. So, let's start. So, how do we define federalism? So, federalism is basically just a method or a system of sharing power between a central government and its constituent units. These constituent units are called as provinces or states, and the idea is that this division of power is mandated or is enabled by your constitution. In other words, your constitution allows the government to divide different policy matters between the central government and the provincial government. And the rationale for adopting for this federal form of governance is that these different constituent units and the national government collectively want to achieve common goals that are set out for the country. Most large countries of the world have adopted federalism, which means is that they have actually a federal system of governance. And the reason why they have chosen this form of governance system is because naturally it's easy to govern a big country by dividing power into different administrative units. It's naturally easy to govern smaller administrative units or smaller constituent units as opposed to governing the entire country collectively. So, most of these constituent units within these big federations are actually characterized by significant diversities. Diversities in terms of the size of the constituent unit or the size of the province or the size of the state. So, some provinces are, large in terms of the area that they cover, some tend to be smaller. So, in case of Pakistan, I'm sure all of you know that Balochistan is the largest province in terms of the area that it covers. However, it's very sparsely populated. So, there's a variation in population among constituent units or provinces as well. Punjab, for instance, is densely populated as compared to Balochistan. Similarly, there is diversity or difference in the level of income in these provinces as well. Some provinces tend to be, doing well economically, others not so. So the job of the federal government or the central government is to basically provide relief to those provinces which are not doing economically well. And in the subsequent sections of this lecture, I'll show how the federal government tries to help out or how the federal government tries to distribute resources to different provinces or states in federations. Similarly, different constituent units are also distinct in terms of their historical context, in terms of their historical background. They also tend to vary on the basis of the ethnicity or on the basis of their cultural context. I think all of us are aware that in countries like Pakistan and India, where there's a lot of ethnic and cultural diversity, it makes sense to allow separate provinces to deal with, their own matters in a cultural context. For instance, just to give you one example, so I think both India and Pakistan are good example, because in India as well, the north part of the country is totally different in terms of the cultural context, in terms of the language that they speak, and the southern part is different as well. Same is the case with Pakistan. In KPK, people speak Pashto. In Sindh, they speak Sindhi. So, whenever you are formulating laws or coming up with institutions, or whether you are defining what should be the, for instance, the official language of a particular state or province, then it makes sense that you are not using a uniform approach or a centralized approach of, let's say, imposing Urdu all over the country, but rather you've allowed these different provinces, constituent units, that you can come up with your own policies which are actually related to your context. So these are some reasons why it makes sense for larger countries to actually be divided into smaller constituent units on the basis of all of these factors. So, what is the opposite of federalism? I mean, countries naturally, not all countries of the world have actually adopted a federal form of government. So, the opposite of federal countries is basically unitary governments. These are governments in which the sovereignty or the power exclusively lies with the central government. In other words, that the central government gets to make all the decisions for all the or for the entire country essentially. And most smaller countries, or countries which are not characterized by a lot of diversity in terms of their culture or ethnicity, tend to be unitary governments, right? So, for example, Scandinavian countries, they have adopted a unitary form of government. And here, the reason for using this unitary form of government is because, again, these countries tend to be homogenous in terms of their ethnicities. Apart from that, they have populations of just 6 to 7 to 8 million. So it doesn't make sense to actually divide the country into different provinces or states. However, please bear this in mind, that in unitary government there is some level of decentralization as well. What decentralization means is that you have actually devolved, or you have given power to certain local governments or subnational governments. However, the unitary governments, the central government has decided how much power it wants to give to these subnational governments or local communities. So, another example from Scandinavia is that even though these countries have unitary form of governments, however, they do have these local communes or local councils which try to deal with local governments and issues related to a particular city, town, etc. Right? So let's move on. So, the key advantage of a federal form of government is that it promotes decentralized decision making. That decision making basically happens at the lowest possible level. Naturally, it's not possible for a country like Pakistan, which has a population more than 200 million. So, a prime minister sitting at the central government does not know about, for example, concerns about people living in rural Sindh, for instance, or people living in some far-flung area of Balochistan, right? So he's sitting. His seat is in Islamabad, so it's kind of hard for him to go out to these regions and figure out what the issues of these particular communities are, right? So a federal form of government basically helps is that by dividing power or giving power to the government of Sindh, for example, the Sindh government is now going to be in a better position to understand or to get to know the issues faced by urban areas of Sindh and rural areas of Sindh, and they can make policies accordingly, right? So, what are some advantages of decentralized decision making, which happens as a result of federal form of government? So there's greater freedom of choice for provinces or states in terms of the policies that they adopt. So Punjab can adopt totally different type of policies depending on the community that it's serving. Sindh can sort of adopt different type of policy. Similarly, there's diversity of preferences in public services as well. People in Punjab might need some other different kind of public services. Maybe if Punjab is more developed, probably they do not need as much attention in terms of the education services, as opposed to, let's say, Balochistan, where there's a dearth of good education or good public or private schools. So the province of Balochistan can basically focus more on providing those public services which are crucial to the needs of Balochis. Similarly, federalism basically allows greater political participation as well. This basically means that people at the lower level can actually participate in political activities as well. Similarly, federations or decentralized decision making also allows greater innovation in which public services are actually designed. For instance, the local communities or local governments of Punjab can try out a different mechanism of providing services. On the other hand, the local governments of Sindh can be creative in providing services in a different fashion, which fulfills the needs of those communities. Similarly, a greater decentralization through federations also allows greater accountability, because you can now hold individual provinces and states accountable for their actions. For instance, drawing from the example of the wheat and sugar crisis which happened in Pakistan, you can actually hold, the same government accountable for shortages of wheat and sugar, and similarly, you can hold accountable Punjab government as well. So if you just have a national government, it's a bit difficult to actually figure out who was involved in some sort of misgiving and to hold individuals accountable, as opposed to when you have actually divided or devolved power to the lower level to different actors, you can actually hold them accountable for their actions. So, do you guys know how many countries of the world have actually adopted a federal form of government? Any guesses? So, around 27 countries of the world have actually adopted federalism, which is that they are federal governments, and these countries are actually home to over 40% of the world's population. Most of these countries, as I previously mentioned, tend to be very large or very populous. So, it includes countries like India, Canada, the US. In a bit, I'll show you some examples of these countries as well. But this statistic also shows that most of the world, or 60% of the world's population, is governed by unitary governments. Please bear this in mind. Unitary governments also have some system of decentralization whereby they devolve power at the local government level. However, these national governments or central governments in the unitary form of governments basically have this discretion whether they want to devolve power or not. However, as opposed to federal countries of the world, their constitution basically dictates that you have to devolve power no matter what. So this is just a world map which is showing different countries of the world which are federations. So if you look at these sort of location pins, all of these location pins refer to different federations of the world. So just let's look. Canada is a federation, US is a federation, so is Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, and again these are really large populous countries. Similarly, in Africa, we see Nigeria is a federal republic, so is South Africa, right? Here we have Pakistan, India, right? And there are some countries in Europe as well, which are federations. So let's see the list. Here's the complete list of all the world's federations. So you have Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belau, Belgium, Bosnia. You can just take a look here. These are the list of some of the countries which have actually adopted a federal form of government. So, the way federalism is actually practiced around the world is quite different, actually. So, it doesn't mean that all countries which have adopted a federal form of government tend to be similar. So, it doesn't mean that Pakistan is, since it's a federation, is similar to India, for example, which is also a federation in the way power is devolved, in the way how the two countries are governed. Similarly, Canada is a federation, so is the US. So it doesn't mean that both Canada and US are governed in a similar fashion. So there's quite a lot of diversity in the way federalism is actually practiced around the world. So let's see what is this variety or diversity in the way federalism is practiced. So one of the key characteristic is that federations of the world can have as few as two territorial units or constituent units or more than 80. Does anybody know which country has over 80 constituent units or different provinces, territories and regions? Any guesses? Okay, so Russia has almost more than 80 regions, provinces, and the way they have classified these regions is different. So some of these are called states, other are called just regions, etc. So the classification of these territorial units is done differently in different parts of the world as well. Similarly, there's a small island in the Caribbean called Saint Kitts and Nevis. So it has just two territorial units. So basically, just two island nations come under this. So basically, it depends on the country, the size of the country, on the basis of the size of the population of a country. The country basically decides whether it wants to have two, three, four, or more than 50 constituent units. So there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of number of constituent units. Similarly, federations tend to be either highly centralized. What do we mean by highly centralized? That power is concentrated at the central level, or these federations can actually be highly decentralized, which means that you have given extensive or a lot of autonomy, a lot of power and discretion to the provincial units. So, just an example, prior to the 18th Amendment, in the subsequent sections, I'll explain what the 18th Amendment is. You could call Pakistan as a highly centralized country. So, even though our constitution termed us that we are a federal republic, but we hadn't really given a lot of power to the provinces in terms of the policies they could make. But however, after the passage of 18th Amendment, we can say that Pakistan has become slightly more decentralized as opposed to prior the passage of the 18th Amendment. Similarly, different federal republics of the world have either adopted a parliamentary form of government or a presidential form of government. So, a parliamentary form of government is a form of government where the prime minister has the most power, or you can say most power is exercised by the office of the prime minister and his cabinet. A presidential system, on the other hand, is a form of system whereby most of the power is actually held by the president and he's directly elected and he represents the mandate or the will of the people. So we see that countries like US, for example, countries like Brazil, even though they are a federation, they have adopted a presidential form of government. As opposed to countries like Pakistan or India, we are a federation as well, but we have adopted a parliamentary form of government. Similarly, in terms of variety of federalism, certain federal countries have just two political party system, which means that only two parties basically govern or hold the entire political landscape of that country. And some countries, on the other hand, have a multi-party system. So, US again is a good example whereby you only have Republican and Democrat Party, which basically competes with each other, as opposed to, for instance, Pakistan, whereby, or you have a multi-party system whereby multiple parties compete. Similarly, another example of a multi-party system is Germany, which is a federation divided into different states and provinces. So it has actually a wide range of political parties which compete for power. Similarly, if you adopt a federal form of government, it's not a guarantee that you will be a stable country in terms of, you know, the political activity which happens in your country. So federation is no guarantee that there'll be political stability in your country. So certain federations of the world tend to be very stable in terms of the way power is the way power is distributed among people. Other federations tend to be unstable, right? So again, US is an example of a stable country. Some African countries like Nigeria, even though there are federations, they tend to be unstable in terms of the way political power is distributed. And these unstable federations tend to have frequent military coups, military dictatorships, and there is no smooth transition of power from one party or from one government to another. So, despite having this diversity in federations, or the way the federal form of government is practiced, there are certain common characteristics of all federal states, and you need to understand these common characteristics. So, let's go through these one by one. So, the first and foremost condition or a characteristic which is common to all federal countries of the world is that there are at least two orders of the government, right? So there are at least two tiers of the government. These orders can also be called tiers. One tier or one order is for the entire country, which is like a central government or a national government, and the other tier is for regions, provinces, or different constituent units, right? So it's important that you have at least two orders or two tiers of the government. In certain parts of the country, in certain parts of the world, there are actually more than two tiers of the government as well, whereby you have one tier which is the tier or order of national government, the other is for provinces, and the third tier is for the local government. So it depends, it varies from country to country. So what are some common names of constituent units? I've previously mentioned these as well. These constituent units can be called either states, provinces. So they're called states in the US, for example. They're called provinces in India and Pakistan. They can also be called Länder. This is a German word. These are German states. Similarly, they can be called cantons. So, this particular word refers to states or provinces in Switzerland, or they can be called communities as well. The word communities is generally used in some Latin American countries and Spain as well. Another characteristic is that all federations of the world have a written constitution, naturally. However, the condition for federalism is that some part of this written constitution cannot be changed by the federal government alone, right? So, if there are bits which are related to a province or a state, so that particular province or the state has to approve changes in this particular written constitution. So, if you guys remember in previous lectures, I had given you this example that when NWFP was going to be renamed to KPK, this was a constitutional amendment. So, we had to change the way NWFP was named in the constitution. So this change could not have been brought alone by the national government or by the central government. So once this constitutional amendment was passed by the central government, it had to go to the KPK assembly, and they had to give the go ahead for the change in this constitution. So this is an example that in federal countries, if you have to change a constitution, which constitution and that particular element of the constitution which is related to the provinces, you have to take the province's blessing for doing this particular change or amendment. Your third characteristic is that in most federal countries of the world, there are some special arrangements in the form of upper houses in the parliament, which basically represent all constituent units, right? So most countries of the world, which are federations, have the house or like a upper house, or they're generally called as senate as well, whereby all units are actually represented there. So Pakistan is a good example. US is a good example. We have a Senate, so does US, and here people from or legislative individuals from different states, provinces come to represent their states in the Senate. The last sort of characteristic of federal states is that in all federations, there are a set of processes or a set of mechanisms or institutions in place which facilitate or basically coordinate relations between different levels of government. Naturally, in order to ensure that there's a smooth coordination between the national government and the provincial government, you need to have some sort of a mechanism, or you need to have certain institutions which can actually facilitate the relationship between the central government and different provincial governments. So, all countries of the world have actually gotten these processes or institutions in place. In some subsequent slides, I'll show you what are some institutions which are available in the case of Pakistan, which coordinate relationship between our central government and different provinces. So let's move on. So let's try to move away from federalism and try to define what intergovernmental relations are. Because if you guys remember, the topic of our session is actually intergovernmental administration. So it was important that I explain you first what federalism is and then link it to what intergovernmental relations and intergovernmental administration or management is. So, what is intergovernmental relations? So these are basically financial, legal, political, and administrative relationships established among all units of government that possess varying or different degrees of authority and jurisdictional autonomy. So let's try to break down this definition. What do we mean by financial relationships? So financial relationship means that how does the federal government of Pakistan, for example, distributes money or financial resources to different constitutional units or different provinces, right? Legal relations means is that how do we ensure that which policy matter or which legal matter is going to be dealt just by the federal government and which legal matters are going to be dealt by the provincial governments. So let's take the example of education. So it poses this question: does the national government or the sitting government, which is sitting in Islamabad, get to make all the education related policy for the provinces, or the provinces like Sindh, Balochistan, they get to make their own laws related to education, for instance, right? When it comes to political relationships, it means is that how do we sort of elect individuals at the national level? How do we elect individuals at the provincial level? And what is going to be the relationship between the assemblies of a provincial government, and what is going to be the relationship with assemblies established at the national government. Similarly, another sort of relationship is related to administrative relationships. So, administrative relationships are that if certain policy guidance is coming from the national government, how is it going to be implemented in the case of a provincial government? Or let's say a provincial government passes a law, a certain, or it mandates the creation of a certain agency at provincial level. How does the provincial level actually establish certain administrative setups to ensure that that particular policy is implemented, right? So these are different varieties of relationships that need to be coordinated between the central government and your provincial government. And what do we mean by jurisdictional autonomy? Jurisdiction by a definition means that each province has a certain sort of area that it can regulate on. So, for instance, the province of Punjab can only make policies related to Punjab. It cannot sort of step into the jurisdiction of areas of Sindh, for instance, right? So, the national government has to keep this in mind, the autonomy of each and every provincial government when it comes to governing all of these relationships. So let's move on. What do we mean by intergovernmental administration and management? So, very simply, it means that how do you manage and coordinate these relationships that you have established here among different governments for the purpose of achieving specific policy goals, for example, right? So let's go back to this example of the wheat crisis and the sugar crisis, which happened a couple of months ago. So, as a result of shortage of wheat or sugar, the idea is how does the federal government sort of manage its and coordinates its relationship with the provincial governments to ensure that there is no shortage at the Punjab level or at the Sindh level, for instance, right? So, I hope this is clear to you. Let's move on. So, since we were talking about different sort of relationships, financial relationships, legal relationships, administrative relationship, another key question within federalism is that how do you assign legal powers to different provinces or different states? What's the model that you used for assigning this power? So, there are different models of federalism which basically govern relationships between federal government and the provincial government. So two of these models are this dual, or it's also called a classical federalism model. Another model is called the this integrated or cooperative federalism model. So this might be new for you. So I'll try to explain it to you. What do we mean by this? So let's start. So, in a dualist or a classical model, the responsibilities of a federal and state governments are separate and distinct. So, this essentially means is that your constitution strictly or clearly defines what a federal government is supposed to do and what a provincial government is supposed to do. So, in the case of Pakistan, we know clearly that matters related to defense, related to foreign affairs are just going to be done by or carried out by the federal government, as opposed to matters related to, for example, education or matters related to tourism policy. These are matters which are going to be just dealt by the provincial governments. The federal government cannot have any say in these particular matters. So, and again, the idea is that each order of the government or each tier of the government basically delivers programs in its own area of responsibility, right? So, this area of responsibility has been defined in your constitution. And how do you implement these programs? By using the civil services and departments which are established at the federal level and at the provincial level. So, the key point of a dualist or a classical model of federalism is that power and responsibility is clearly divided between state government and your provincial government, right? So please also bear this in mind that in all dualist constitutions or in all dualist federations, there are also a list of shared powers, or these shared powers are also called concurrent powers. And these powers are powers in which both orders or both tiers of the government have to make laws collectively in a shared manner. So, in a bit, I'll tell you guys the case of Pakistan in terms of which responsibilities need to be legislated together by the federal government or the national or the provincial government, right? So some examples of countries which have a dualist form of government or a dualist form of federalism are Pakistan, USA, Canada, and Brazil. In the case of Pakistan, I just mentioned that there are certain policy matters which can only be legislated by the federal government. Others are left for provincial governments. For example, any matter related to currency or the way the monetary policy of the country is going to be designed, it's strictly going to be dealt by the federal government. In matter related to education or related to youth affairs, these are matters which are going to be just dealt by the provincial government. So as opposed to a dualist model, we have this cooperative or integrated model. In this particular model, your power or your responsibility is not very neatly neatly shared or neatly defined between the central government and your provincial government. However, your national and state governments are expected to act as partners in following the interest of the entire country, right? So what happens here is that your central government is assigned to this general lawmaking role, whereby they make or they provide all the policy guidance to your states or your provinces. On the other hand, your subnational governments, in other words your provinces or states, are basically provided this responsibility of implementing all the laws or policies which are actually provided by the central government. So here the idea is that your local governments or your central governments are helping out implementing these different policies which are actually defined by the central government. But please bear this in mind: whenever the central government is actually coming up with the policies or coming up with different laws, it actually comes up with these laws in consultation with your subnational governments. So both the central government and the national government actually cooperate together to come up with a piece of law, and in terms of the implementation, the discretion lies with the subnational government or with the province to implement that particular policy framework into the local communities. Some excellent example of a cooperative or integrated model of federalism are Germany, Austria, South Africa, and Spain. So Germany is a good example because you have these states whereby the most of the policy making or policy guidance comes from the central government in close cooperation with the subnational government, and these states are equipped quite a lot in terms of implementing or executing all of these laws or policies which are made at the central government level. So in terms of concurrent powers, you can actually say that in cooperative or integrated models of federalism, there tend to be a lot of shared or concurrent powers between central government and provincial government, and there is no strict or you can say distinct legislative list whereby it says that the the policy related to tourism or education is just going to be dealt by a state, right? That's not the case here in the cooperative or integrated model. So let's move on. Another important topic under federalism is actually fiscal federalism. There's a huge body of literature just on fiscal federalism. So, what is fiscal federalism? It's basically related to how your public finances or how your monetary resources are divided between different tiers of a government in a federal system. So, simply speaking, it basically means that how do you divide or share your financial resources between your central government and your provincial or state government. So it basically deals with how you tax, how the taxing, spending, and regulatory functions are allocated or assigned among different tiers of the government. For instance, how which particular aspects should be taxed by the federal government, which aspects should be taxed by the provincial governments. Once you have collected these taxes, you have to decide which how much chunk of these taxes are going to be spent by the federal government and how much is going to be spent by the provincial government, and so forth. So in the previous lectures, I think I've mentioned to you guys that income tax, for example, is collected by the federal government, right? So we know clearly here that the provincial governments cannot collect um income taxes, right? So this is a decision, a conscious decision made by our government, made by our constitution, which defines these taxing powers between the central government and the provincial government. Similarly, fiscal federalism also deals with how your intergovernmental transfers are structured. So what do intergovernmental transfers mean? So these are basically financial transfers between central government and provincial government. So now the question is that since this income tax is collected from all over the country, you have to have a sound mechanism in terms of distributing this income tax to different provinces as well, right? So these are some concerns or some matters which are dealt by fiscal federalism. In a bit, once we'll move on to our discussion on the way federalism is practiced in the case of Pakistan, I'll explain how fiscal federalism is actually implemented in Pakistan. So, the previous part of our lecture basically concluded the entire theory and some aspects of practice of federalism in general and how federalism is actually practiced around the world. In the second half of the lecture, the idea is that we are going to understand how federalism is governed or how federalism is implemented in the case of Pakistan. We are going to see how intergovernmental relations are actually structured in Pakistan, and in the last bit, we are going to see how fiscal federalism is implemented in our country. So let's move on. In terms of what is the state of federalism in Pakistan. So I'm sure all of you know that according to our constitution, we are a federal republic, and our constitution stipulates that we have three tiers of government. We have a national level, we have a provincial level, and we have a local level. And Pakistan has been a federation since independence, and there are multiple reasons why we have adopted a federal republic. The first and foremost reason is because we inherited a federation as a result of the constitution legacy of British India. That is, prior to partition, the provinces which became part of Pakistan were actually treated as provinces back then as well. For example, Punjab was a separate province, Sindh was a separate province, etc. I'll explain a bit more about this constitution legacy in the next slide. Another reason of why we are a federation is because it was sort of a matter of necessity that we had two non contiguous territorial units. Non contiguous means that West Pakistan was separated geographically from East Pakistan. I'm sure you know already that there was India in between, and on the sides we had East and West Pakistan. And naturally, since you had this non contiguous territorial units, it made sense that you rule one part of the country separately and you rule the other part of the country separately as distinct units as well. And this particular necessity naturally arose from 1947 till up till 1971. That's the year when East Pakistan basically got separated from West Pakistan. Another reason is that over years, our provinces have actually developed distinct ethnic and linguistic identities of their own, and it naturally made sense that because of this increasing or varying level of ethnic and linguistic identity, it made sense that you actually govern these provinces separately as opposed to sort of governing them in a uniform manner. So, these are some of the rationales of why Pakistan decided to become a federation and actually still is. So let's move on to the bit about how we inherited federalism from the British. So a good example, or you can say good reason of why we are still a federation is because of this Government of India Act 1935. This was just before, this was the act which was implemented up till 1947. And according to this particular act, the idea for coming up with this, passing this piece of legislation was that it wanted to devolve revenue sources to different provincial governments to maintain financial equilibrium. And apart from the devolution of revenue sources of financial resources, it actually divided the legislative powers between the national government, between the central government, and the different provincial governments as well. And the way these legislative powers were actually divided between provincial and national governments, a provincial and national government, was that you had three different types of list. So first of all, you had a federal legislative list. Then you had a legislative list, which was just reserved to the provinces. And lastly, you had a concurrent or a shared list. So what is a federal legislative list? This is a legislative list which includes certain policy matters which are only going to be legislated by the central government. So, in the case of Government of India Act, there were around 59 policy items which were just going to be legislated by the central government. These policy matters related to external affairs, currency and coinage, defense, banking, etc. So any rules, regulations related to banking could only be made by the central government. The provincial government had absolutely no say in making policies related to that. Similarly, in the provincial legislative list, you had around 54 items, and here these particular items dealt with matters related to how to formulate self governments at the local level, then laws related to public health or generic law and order situation, or how you're going to recruit people in the police, or how you're going to be dealing with agriculture, education, etc. So these were all the policy matters which were just going to be legislated by the provincial governments, and your national government had absolutely no say in designing these matters. So here you can say indirectly that your Government of India Act actually gave quite a lot of autonomy to the provinces in terms of legislating on all of these matters. And the third list was this concurrent list or the shared list, which I just mentioned in the previous slides. So these were shared matters on which both the central government and the provincial governments could collectively legislate. So what were these matters? They were related to the welfare of, your communities, any sort of development work that you want to do for your communities. So they had to be collectively decided by the central government and the provincial government. Similarly, any policy matter related to your labor or related to your trade unions or related to matters concerning electricity. So, all of these were part of your concurrent list. That electricity, for example, if you have to decide electricity tariffs or electricity policies, there has to be done collectively by the federal government and your provincial governments. And the last component of this Government of India Act was that all of the legislative matters or policy matters which were not included in these lists, they were actually retained by the central government, which is that the residuary powers, the leftover powers, basically are going to be legislated by your central government, right? So, this is one mechanism of providing greater autonomy to your national government or central government. So, more or less, when we were drafting the 1973 constitution after the partition, so this 1973 constitution naturally names Pakistan as a federal republic, and interestingly, it was largely patterned on the 1935 Devolution Act, which I just showed you, except for a few differences. There were some changes which were made in this Devolution Act. So, what were these changes? That previously I just showed you that the Government of India Act had three lists: the legislative list, the list reserved for provinces, and the third one was concurrent list. As opposed to that, the 1973 constitution only had two lists: the federal legislative list and the concurrent legislative list. So, which list is missing? The provincial list, right? So, there was no provision of a provincial legislative list. These were matters which were just going to be decided by your federal government. These concurrent matters are the matters which are going to be collectively sort of designed by our federal government and the national government. So now the question is, what is the role of provincial government? So all the leftover powers, policy items which were not in these two lists, were left to the provinces, right? So all of the residuary functions were left to the provinces, and we saw in the Government of India Act the difference was that all of the residuary functions were actually left with the central government as opposed to the provincial government. So this was like a major difference between the 1973 constitution and the Government of India Act. And the policy matters which went into this federal legislative list and the concurrent list were more or less the same as I just showed you here, right? They were more or less the same. So I think I'll stop here. This basically concludes the part one of week 11 lecture on intergovernmental administration. Please head over to part two of this lecture where we'll resume the rest of the content. So see you guys in the next part.